Okay, we're going to look at Freddy the Great. This is originally an SPI game. One of a few that got republished by Avalon Hill. I have the Avalon Hill copy. And in the history of wargaming, and I didn't know this at the time when I picked it up, this is actually kind of an important game in terms of like a strategic game with leaders and leaders with values on them that did different things. At least that's my understanding now. For myself, this wasn't my first game of that type that I had picked up, although I was kind of close to that era. I had War and Peace before that because I was a little more into Napoleon. So to some extent, I mean, that certainly wasn't, any kind of big revelation to me. Oh my God, look, there's leaders and I can play with them and do things. Although the leadership was more complex in this than it is in War and Peace. But it felt like, okay. It just didn't feel earth-shattering to me that there were leaders. And it did kind of lead me to wonder, hey, why are games like 1776 don't have leaders? The biggest flaw for me with this game was that it's a collection of scenarios of each year of Frederick's 7 Years' War campaigns. There's no campaign game in it. And that was very disappointing, especially after coming from War and Peace or 1776, these games that handled the whole situation fairly well, one way or another. Whereas this focused just on, these yearly campaigns, and it's not like I didn't play the small scenarios in 1776 or War and Peace. Now, that's actually much to my disadvantage because in War and Peace, at least, the small scenarios may be better than the campaign, and that may be the case here too. Anyway, as I went through time, I don't remember what it was. I don't know if it was a 3W or a Decision Games game. But something that was very, very similar to this, same topic, same kind of leadership rules and strength points, covering the war in yearly campaigns, but with a campaign game on it. And I don't know if that was the point at which, I think that was the point at which I started trying to formulate campaign rules for this or somewhere around there. I don't remember what the game was, but anyway, I started coming up with some values that I think these pieces of paper have something to do with in terms of production costs between campaigns and stuff like that, so that people could, so that I could play it ranging from one scenario to the next, kind of like I tried to do with Imperial Romanum, which has a similar problem. What I didn't know was that there was a general magazine on, on this game, released probably similar, around the same time as the game was released, or soon after, because that tended to be the case, where Joe Balkowski wrote a campaign game for it. So I'm going to give that a shot here. Also in that same magazine is the Silesian Wars, which is a bunch of scenarios for the Silesian Wars. I'm not going to touch those. There might be a way of integrating the same kind of campaign rules with the essentially what I'd call the War of Austrian Succession, but that set of history and the game as history kind of seems to see that as a separate piece in the whole puzzle. So, because in some sense, Frederick grabbing Silesia had very little to do with the succession itself, but it was impacted by it. And anyway, he was just greedy. So that's what we're going to do. And what I've done is this campaign, and we'll get to that in a bit, allows you to kind of free set up and play different diplomatic starting points. I'm going to take the diplomatic choices that Frederick made at the beginning of the campaign. So I set this up as if I was setting up the 1756 campaign. I'm going to invade Saxony and let the dice land where they will as to what that's going to do. However, let's take a look at the rules. Well, let's take a look at some of the components before we look at the rules. You got a kind of standard map here. I never really liked this map. I'm sure it's a Simonson map. It shows a lot of the traits of his maps, but it reminds me a little bit of the feel and flavor of the Avalon Hill maps in a way that, I don't know, maybe the color choices. It was probably more subdued in the original. Where you've got a little bit of terrain, you got rivers, you got mountains, you got mountain passes, which will let you go through the mountains, you got important fortified cities, which have a victory point marker inside of each of them. Sequence of play is printed up here, which is useful, I guess. Turn record track with reinforcements and such not in it. A rather complicated combat results table, which we're going to have to talk about, because that is actually kind of interesting. This is the beginning of things getting more interesting over on the SPI side, I think, right around that era. Siege table, calculation for combat losses, which are percentage based, and then your terrain effects chart, which again, there isn't a lot of terrain in this. Mainly movement point costs. There's some other effects. The pieces. You got strength point counters. I love strength point counters. I think they work very well in general in the big strategic games. You got leader counters. Leader counters have a number of values on them. They have a rank. The lower your rank, the higher up, more highly ranked you are. So it's an ordering there. So like Frederick will be rank 1. An initiative value, and then both an attack and a defense bonus. To handle that, let's see what else we have. We have a bunch of different nationalities. It's kind of difficult to tell the French and the Austrians apart. Not so much with the combat counters where they say French or Austrian, although for sorting I had trouble with that because of the coloring. But the leaders, I'm not sure I have all the leaders in the right stacks. We'll see. They're just too close together. I mean, this gray and this white, I cannot distinguish them. You have some demoralized markers, and you have depots. The game is going to take supply into consideration, and you got to be in range of your depots or of a fortress. Okay. It's actually not a complicated game. Given the era, you wouldn't be surprised by that. So it's an I go, you go. First, the Prussian turn happens. They get any reinforcements, they're due to get on the board. Then any of their units that are demoralized, they can make a check to see if they remoralize. They're allowed to start creating, well, first, any depots that they have under construction, if they meet the requirements, become constructed. And then they're allowed to construct new depots. And basically, you need a big stack of units, and you need to be in supply for this to happen. And then you're allowed to march. One neat thing in this game is march is done by a die roll. You roll a die, and you add the initiative for each of your leaders, and you get to move them. Now, movement in this game is kind of complicated in a sense, or kind of strange. You're strictly required to move your units in a certain order. And I think that's actually to prevent them from having to write more rules. I think it's an attempt to reduce the amount of rules that have to be written. But it is an odd flavor to it. Then your opponent gets to do what's called a forced march. It's basically a reaction move. They can look to any of their units, roll a die, and move them based on their initiative rating there. And that can be either to run away from combat or to join into combat. And then you have combat where either player has the option to start combat, but I believe the initiative player gets the first option. All the strengths are hidden on the board, and you see things that are upside down. Those are actually just in fortresses. Don't worry about it. The game is not going to have the majority of pieces on the board flipped over, but it'll eventually. But it'll probably have the majority of hexes that are occupied. And you'll see I have little, because the counters aren't double printed, I have little indications of who owns the thing. Now, the fact that you can't look through your opponent's pieces means it's not really that big a deal. To have things like that, the Austrians are kind of hard to read. I did them in highlighter, and there may be some like this one that don't have any marking at all. I probably will not increase the number that I have marked. Okay. Then if you've got a siege going on, which has specific rules, you have to build a depot outside, etc. You're allowed to make a roll on the siege table. And if you get a breach, that triggers a number of decisions that each player has to make, which could end up in you storming the city. And then the non-phasing player has an attrition phase, where they have to make sure that they're in supply or they lose some strength points. And then you go and repeat this for the anti-Prussian player. Clever term. Should be the coalition, I think. And then on even-numbered game turns, you have a prisoner of war exchange, which is mandatory. And then the turn marker moves forward. And this will keep going generally in the campaign scenarios until everybody reaches their winter quarters and you don't want to fight no more. And that forces its end here, but you may be making your choice as far up as here not to engage. Okay. All right, so for movement, during the march phase, the phasing player can move his leaders. He rolls, I believe, a single die. Let's see. I believe he rolls a single die and adds his initiative rating. And that's how many movement points that he'll be able to move during that movement phase. Oh, here we go. Yeah, you roll one die for all your leaders. And so you can either be very active or not. But a leader like Frederick, has a fairly high initiative rating of +3. Now, if I recall correctly, though, you never get more than 6 movement points. Oh, no, you do. Okay, force marches, though. During force march, you're allowed to move units that you didn't, that in a reaction type move. And what you do is you roll a die. For each leader, add your initiative rating. However, you can't move more than 6 movement points no matter what with that. Now, here's the weirdness. If your sum of the die roll plus initiative is 6 or higher, you lose a strength point, which means the higher initiative leaders, even to just move 1 hex, are very likely to lose some of their strength because of that, which is kind of a weirdness in the game. You wouldn't think that Frederick would be worse at moving 1 hex than maybe one of his less effective subordinates. Movement standard, moving hex by hex. The one thing is, when you enter an enemy hex, you pay an extra movement point. Let me see if there's more than that. Well, I guess kind of the big thing is, during the normal movement phase, you have to move your nations one at a time, if you control more than one nation, which you probably will. And you have to move starting with the highest precedence leader, the one with the lowest rank number on him, first and down the way. And that allows the game to kind of, I think, get rid of a few rules. because you can pick up and drop off units, but something that's moved before can't move again. You can never move more than 6 movement points. So that's interesting. Yeah, so this is here, yeah. Prussian leader has a movement allowance of 6, despite the fact that he has 7. Yeah, so I was right. It's always 6. But there's no penalty. You don't end up losing men for the normal march if you roll too high. You have to, there's a sort of a general rule that you have to keep, let me see how it's written here. Detachments by leaders of a given nationality may not be made in a manner which causes any single subordinate commander to be in command of more of his nation's strength than are under the command of the supreme commander. What's not covered there is if you've got 2 subordinate commanders in a space, like say the rank 2 and 3 commanders under the Prussians, you don't have to give the larger force if you split them to the higher ranked person. It's just that the overall commander has to have the largest force on the board. Now, you don't have to go out of your way to fix this. You're not forced to consolidate troops to make sure that that Frederick, or whoever the rank 1 leader is, has more troops than some other commander. You just can't voluntarily make that situation happen. You can move through friendly units. You can enter an enemy-occupied hex. It costs you 1 additional movement point. It doesn't cost any extra to leave. And you can't move over impassable terrain, which includes mountains without passes. All right. During movement, you might be able to do an overwhelming attack. When you move into a space with an enemy force, you can declare that you're going to try an overwhelming attack. You announce how many strength points you have in your force. If you have at least 4 times as much as your opponent, he has to announce that, and you've just wiped him out. It doesn't cost you anything extra. If you fail, it doesn't cost you anything either, except that you've just revealed how many strength points you moved into that hex. Which is the one reason you might not want to do it. If you're pretty sure you don't have an overwhelming attack, you may not want to give your opponent that clue, because that may affect, some of their decisions. Now, in an overwhelming attack, terrain and leadership are not going to be taken into account. If you unsuccessfully overwhelmingly attack, you can continue movement. This is a little different than most games. Most games, when you declare something like that, you're forced into combat. There's no penalty whatsoever to doing so, except that you moved into the hex. And therefore, you can leave the hex. But you could also stay where you are, in which case you probably want to fight a battle. But maybe you just want to be there. If you enter an enemy-occupied hex by crossing a mountain pass, you may not leave that hex in the same movement phase unless you made an overwhelming attack successfully. If you choose to do so and you're unsuccessful, the force which moved into the hex cannot decline to attack. It must make the first attack during the combat phase. Each force you move into a hex can make an overwhelming attack, but it does so on its own. You can't add in the other units to it. Okay. This game handles the small war, little war, or whatever, the Austrian Grenzers and Hussars and such not, which were used to intervene in supply factors. And I didn't know anything about this when I first read these rules, so they didn't really link to me way back in the day. Austrian combat units have a zone of control. The 6 hexes immediately surrounding a hex occupied by 1 or more Austrian combat units is their zone. The zone has no effect on movement, combat, or retreats. The only thing it does is basically interfere with enemy supply. And you can trace supply into the zone of control, but not through it. Your zone of control is negated if there's an enemy in your hex. So if you walk up and attack an Austrian unit, its zone of control will not cut your supply, for what that matters. There's no limitation to stacking except 1 depot per hex. Yeah. Units stacked together fight together as their own. They give a very specific positioning of which units are where. I'm not sure what the point of that is. It doesn't seem to serve much game purpose, but it may again serve some simplicity in the rules. So for example, there's places where they talk about the unit directly over a different unit has some has control, indicates control of something, but I don't think it really makes much difference. The leaders themselves, we talked about the rank of the leader. Whoever's in command is whoever's the highest ranked, i.e. lowest numbered, leader in a stack. However, multinational forces are handled a little differently. So the leader of a stack, of a multinational stack, is going to be the one with the most strength points in that force. And then beyond that, you follow the precedence rules. Now, there are weirdnesses here, which is if there's a tie in the number of strength points, it's actually the highest ranked leader. And it doesn't seem to limit you to the highest ranked leader of the nations that are tied. Which is important, because if you have a multinational force, it would make sense that you pick a leader who doesn't actually command the one of the forces involved. That's simply, a higher ranked leader. But it's a very unlikely circumstance, because almost always there will be one force that is larger. If leaders are alone in a hex, they're automatically captured when a combat unit enters them. Okay, combat's a little funky. During combat, the player whose turn is in progress chooses the sequence in which all potential combats are resolved, points to a hex, says we're going to fight there, and then they have the option to attack. If they don't want to attack, then the other player has the option to attack. If both players decline, you just sit there. Now, there's exceptions like the mountain pass. You're not allowed to examine the enemy forces there. If you have a demoralized marker on you, you're not allowed to attack. And don't worry, you can't move into an enemy hex with a demoralized marker on you. So you can't get caught going through a pass and having to attack when you can't attack. You compare the total combat strength points of the attacking force to the defending force. Well, yeah. And you come up with a percentage ratio, rounded down in favor of the defender. Okay. And they're fairly simple percentages here, instead of using odds. Okay. The unit's combat strength is not altered. Terrain and leaders affect the combat die roll, though. And you'll see here, subtract 2 from the combat resolution die roll if you're in a mountain. I think that's the only effect. Yep. Crossing rivers don't provide any defensive bonus, which I find a little disturbing, but okay. Also, whoever the commander of the battle is gets to apply his attack or defense value. But no other leaders in the stack do. If there are no leaders in the stack, they have a 0 initiative, 0 attack bonus, and 0 defense. Let me see, is initiative part of this? This is not the only place where I've seen initiative Yeah, I don't see it. I've seen a couple of places where initiative is called out as having value in combat or implied to have value in combat, and this is one of them, and it doesn't seem to be there. By the way, wonderful thing. I don't usually say this, but this is in the Don Greenwood era. He did not muck with the rules, and it's not the only time where he took an SPI game and just... He may have made change. Balkowski, I think, actually did the rules editing on this, but he may have made changes to the game, and I think there are some hooks for this in there. But what he didn't do was he didn't step in and say, you know what, we're not going to use the SPI format. Now, hiring Balkowski to do the rules editing was probably the only choice Greenwood made in this case. This wasn't actually... I mean, Don Greenwood's name is not on this box. However, I would not be shocked to see his name as a designer or developer over on BGG, because somehow that happened. He got inserted into every single Avalon Hill game. Okay. When the only thing he did was choose Joe Balkowski. Okay. So what you're going to get as a value when you roll the dice is a percentage loss, and the left-hand side is how much the attacker loses, the right-hand side is how much the defender loses, and some possible ladders. A P indicates that the entire force has just surrendered and is all prisoners of war. An L indicates that the lowest ranked leader in the force is killed. Now, not lowest ranked, that a leader of the player's choice is killed. Now, this means you probably never want to have a good leader alone leading a force. If you can help it, you want to make sure that you can avoid those L's from being devastating by having a shitty leader along with all your good one, with, you know, whatever good one you have there. May not always be possible, but it's a factor. Okay. If only a leader or depot is left at the end, they're captured by the enemy, as long as there's a strength point left. I'm looking for who wins the battle. During the combat phase, after combat and prisoner losses are subtracted, the remainder of the defeated force must immediately be retreated. Yeah, so somewhere here it tells who defeats who. I am going to have to swap batteries shortly, so I'm going to do that now and look for the roll that I'm looking for. In the habit of praising SPI rolls, one of the things that's kind of weird about them is this division of like a procedure, which tells you certain things, and then the cases that come under. And usually what you're looking for is in the cases, but in some cases, it's in the procedure, and this is the point. The procedure gives you the broad outline of the rule, but usually the cases spell that out. In this case, let's see. To determine the victor, each player adds the number of enemy strength points eliminated in battle to his commander's initiative rating. If the opposing totals are equal, the battle is considered a draw and nobody takes any further actions. If they're unequal, whoever has the highest won the battle, and is given enemy strength points equal to that difference as prisoners of war. Then after the prisoners of war are determined, you find out, you handle the retreat after combat, if there's still anything left, and the retreat will be a roll of a die plus the initiative value of the leader commanding the retreating force. And it must retreat as a single group, expending its full movement allowance. It's got to head towards supply, and this is one place where initiative matters in battle. And you get a demoralized marker if you were retreated. Because you're demoralized, you must retreat as a single stack, and it's possible that you're moved by a leader of a different nationality. Normally, leaders have to be associated with any troops that are moving on the board. Okay. We're going to pause here again, just so I can take a little bit of a break, and we'll get to the supply rules. But this is actually the heart of the game. We've got a couple of chromey things. We've got the supply rules, which don't have a lot of effect. And then we go on to the big stuff, which is new to me, the campaign game rules. Supplies. Basically, if you can't trace supply, you take a loss of 1 unit during your supply phase, which happens at the end of the opposing player's turn. So he can cut your supply off and cost you a unit. Supply is sourced from one of two places. Well, either a fortress or an operative supply depot. For a fortress to count as a supply source, it's got to have one of your friendly combat strength points inside of it, and quite a few of the fortresses on the board already do. A depot is also only a supply source if it's operative. There has to be a strength point in the hex occupied by the depot. Otherwise, I'm not sure what the depot is. It's just like because they're non-aligned, so there's no real way to indicate who owns the depot if there isn't a force on it. The depot also has to be part of a network of supply units going back to a fortress with a friendly strength point in it. Supply path is traced from the source to the unit being supplied. It's allowed to be a number of hexes based on the nationality. The Prussian Allied forces have a supply length of 5 hexes, and the coalition has a supply range of 4 hexes. Now these can be blocked by enemy units. Enemy units block you from tracing supply through them. And also by the Austrian zone of control. The depot itself is created during the depot creation phase. First, any depots that are eligible that were being created are completed by flipping them face up. It's got to be in a hex with a minimum of 10 friendly strength points during depot creation. If you ever move out of there and don't have the 10 strength points anymore, you end up losing the depot that you're building. And it has to be in supply while it's being created, etc. If you end up capturing a fortress that you have a depot outside of, your depot is destroyed, you've taken the fortress. You can leave your strength point in the fortress instead. You can voluntarily destroy depots that you control. Again, I don't think you'd leave a hex and just leave a depot lying around, but apparently you can. Right. Okay, so leaders have restrictions as to moving out of supply. A leader with a 0 initiative can never leave supply, and unless he's stacked with better leader. If he begins a friendly movement phase out of supply, he must be in supply at the end of that movement phase if possible. If it's impossible, well, he takes his attrition. But he has to move as close as possible to a friendly supply source. If you have an initiative of 1, you can leave supply during your movement phase, but if you begin a movement phase out of supply, you have to try to move back. And if you have an initiative of 2 or higher, you can move out of supply and stay out of supply as much as you like. And like I said, the effect is you lose 1 strength point off that stack if you're out of supply. Morale, well, during combat, if you lose a combat, you get demoralized. The effects of demoralization is you can't split the force, you can't move it into an enemy hex, you have a 0 initiative for all purposes, and except for recovering from demoralization, where your leader's initiative counts. But you're fully combat effective. If undemoralized units move into a hex with demoralized units, they become demoralized. You can build depots when demoralized. You cannot besiege because you can't enter an enemy-occupied hex. And you may not move during friendly force march movement phase. Now, during morale recovery, you roll a die for each unit, and if the sum of the die roll and the initiative is 7 or higher, you remove the demoralized marker from that force. Now, note, this means somebody with a 0 initiative, and there are some, I think, cannot undemoralize. You have to get a better leader there. Fortresses and garrisons, not too exciting. The garrison is placed face down to indicate he's inside the city. I don't know how important that is. I'm doing it, but again, I think this is kind of a notional thing on the board that probably isn't that vital to distinguish. Fortresses, I think you want to be in the city with your forces for the most part. The only exception to that might be, I don't know, if you want to try to trick somebody into a field battle or something. Okay. I'm just looking for something of interest in here that we might need to worry about. Okay. Once you're inside a besieged fortress, you have some restrictions on your movement. You can move outside the fortress, but you can't do anything, and you pretty much have to attack the units that are outside in order to have anything done. That's not quite how it's worded, so I'm not sure. But basically, you can't leave the hex, leaving the fortress unless you fight a battle, and then you can escape. And other forces can't enter the fortress unless they fight a battle. And you could combine and fight the battle together and leave together, or units inside fortresses are not affected by combat or overwhelming attacks. They have their own rules. The siege, enemy garrison fortresses can only be captured by siege. During siege resolution, you can attempt to capture them. Okay, you got to make a die roll for each fortress which is besieged, and you add the initiative. No, you subtract the initiative. Wait, I don't know. I think you compare the initiatives. Yeah, you compare the initiatives. That's what it's saying here, I think. Let me see. Friendly units. The initiative value of the garrison commander is subtracted, and the highest ranked leader of the phasing player, I think, is added. I'm trying to read to see what's here. Okay. However, we haven't gotten into how you do besiege a fortress. So only enemy garrison fortresses can be besieged. You can just grab an empty fortress. What you have to do is you have to build a depot outside the fortress in order to besiege it. And then you have to have an operative depot in the fortress hex containing the enemy garrison fortress. It will be under siege at that point throughout the entire turn, which means you can't wander out or anything like that. And then during combat, the owning player must reveal the total number of combat strength points occupying each hex containing a besieged enemy garrison. So the garrison knows how many troops are besieging it. It's not vice versa. And the siege resolution table basically gives you no effect, an attacker loss, or a breach. The attacker loss is a strength point loss due to sorties. The breach triggers the end of the siege. If there's a breach, whoever's inside, no matter how big they are, must ask for honors of war. If they do, the entire garrison is transferred to the nearest friendly garrison, and the city's been taken. However, if you deny the honors of war, then you can request the garrison's surrender. And then the non-phasing player, the person under attack, may either surrender their forces and they become prisoners of war, or they can refuse. If they refuse, both players reveal their entire strength of their forces. Whoever has the least friendly combat strength points is completely eliminated. The leaders are captured. The opposing force loses a number of strength points exactly equal to what the loser lost. This is kind of an interesting situation. You could completely be wiped out trying to storm a citadel, which feels weird to me, to say the least. Okay, every other turn, remember, prisoners of war get exchanged. And the way this happens is it's absolutely mandatory. Combat strength points must be exchanged on a point-for-point basis, coalition to allied forces back and forth. And exchange of captured leaders is mandatory as well, on a one-for-one basis, regardless of any factors. The only exception to that is Frederick himself. If a player has 2 or more leaders to choose from, he may choose which leader to exchange. I think that's as the captor, you get to choose which one you give away. But Frederick has never exchanged. The allied player can immediately forfeit the game if Frederick's captured. If he does, he's lost. Big time. If he doesn't want to forfeit the game, though, he can keep playing, and you just play it out for normal victory conditions. And they'll be returned at the end of the prisoner exchange phase in any non-besieged fortress garrison. At the end of the game, any unexchanged prisoners are considered eliminated, and will be counted for victory points. There's reinforcements in some scenarios. We're not going to deal too much about that, but they come in outside a fortress hex. Right? Reinforcements must be placed in an indicated hex, yeah. Okay, let's keep looking. Winter. Game turns 16, 17, and 18 are considered winter. Winter will affect movement, and special attrition takes place. You lose 1 movement point during winter game turns, which I guess means maximum movement rate is 5. It's not. It doesn't handle every little specific situation in the rules, but that seems like the best way to handle it. At the start of game turn 16, all units inside fortresses are in winter quarters. If they're inside a fortress in turn 16, 17, or 18, they entered winter quarters. Once a unit's in winter quarters, it cannot move nor come out of the fortress unless the fortress is besieged by the enemy and the garrison surrenders or is granted honors of war. The game automatically ends immediately when all units have entered winter quarters. During friendly attrition of each winter game turn, every force that's not in winter quarters will lose a strength point. This is in addition to any attrition a force suffers for being unsupplied. Leader and depot counters are not subject to winter attrition. But the interesting thing here is the garrison of the depot is ruh-roh. And these will be counted for victory conditions. Now, for victory conditions for these games, you give victory points at the end of the game for each fortress you control and they have their victory point values listed on them. You do not get victory points for a besieged fortress. After you sum your victory points for fortresses, you subtract 1 for each strength point that you lost during the game. And unexchanged prisoners of war are considered lost. The Prussian player loses 2 for each friendly combat strength point eliminated in excess of 20, because Prussia has trouble recovering their manpower. No victory points are awarded or subtracted for eliminated leaders. After you get your total, the smaller player's total is subtracted from the larger. You get a differential, and you see this. However, if both players have negative values, it's considered a Pyrrhic victory and much less valuable. And then we have specific scenarios which have specific optional rules, reinforcements, etc. in them that try to cover the different elements of the campaigns. Now, I'm going to be playing this campaign scenario instead, which I'm starting with the 1756 setup, which is more or less what you're supposed to do. What you're actually supposed to do is the Austrians and Prussians are able to set up their forces as they like, and thus take some advantage of the diplomacy. Now, before the game begins, there's going to be some diplomacy in place. No, that's not quite. The game begins on turn 9 of 1756 and proceeds for the remainder of the year. After that, there's a special diplomacy stage. At the beginning of the campaign, Austria and Prussia are at war. All of the nations are neutral. Prussia can freely operate within Prussia and Silesia, and Austria may operate within the borders of Austria. You can cross adjacent borders of your opponents without penalty, but if you ever cross into a neutral country, that neutral has just joined the other side for the duration. You don't need to do anything in the beginning of the war, but historically, Frederick attacked Saxony, and there's a reason for that, which we'll see in a moment. Okay, then after 1756, there's a special grand strategic sequence of play initiated before the beginning of the 1757 turn, and then there's another grand strategic sequence at the beginning of every turn, every year, but the first one is special. So the first one is only done in 1756, sort of. You're going to have some diplomacy points, and I believe it's 4 for the Austrians and 2 for the Prussians, that you applied to the different countries. You roll a die and consult the diplomacy table in order determined by the allegiance of each nation, and basically you add the modifiers. But there are some special modifiers based on the actions in 1756 and other years. Then each player gets resource points, and you have a starting number of points that'll last you for the entirety of the campaign, that you're going to see what percentage increment of your current forces there is. This makes it really, really important. Sorry, this is the random table. This makes it really, really important to maintain the forces you have on the map and not take big losses. Remember, the victory conditions here are heavily modified by losses. Well, I don't quite understand or agree completely with this methodology, but the problem is I could not come up with a good, historically believable point type system a la Empires and Arms for how the armies are able to recuperate. So maybe this will work better. Certainly there's an eye towards that. The problem is if both sides go all out, well, basically the war is over and neither side can replenish their army. But if you have a big army left, if you don't do a lot of bloodletting in the course of the game, you can increase your army by larger percentages. Now, obviously, what you want to do is bludgeon the other guy's army and not take a lot of losses yourself. And then your forces increment. Other countries get a random increase or even decrease in how much force how much their forces are changed. And then each player is allowed to redeploy their fortresses pretty much within their own territory. We'll see how that works. And their territory is defined by the fortresses they control. And then Hanover gives money to whichever side they're on, in the sense of additional resources. And then you'll start the next campaign. There are no special rules for the campaigns. Now, diplomacy happens only once in the 756 campaign for the most part. Prussia has 2 points, Austria has 4, and you can add them to France, Hanover, Russia, Sweden, Saxony, or the Empire. And you can split them up as you like. The absolute value acts as a modifier, but there are other modifiers. So France, if Prussia invades Saxony, France leans towards Austria by 1. If France is allied with Austria, Hanover subtracts 2 from its die roll. And vice versa with Prussia. So Hanover, the British, are going to go on the other side of France. Now they get to roll on other turns as well. Russia adds 1 to the die roll if Saxony was invaded by Prussia in 1756. Subtract 1 if Saxony was invaded by Austria in 1756. And these always work the same way. One side or the other can go for Saxony. Sweden, add 1 to the die roll if Saxony was invaded by Prussia. Saxony and the Empire have no modifiers. Now, if we look at the Saxony chart, Saxony is leaning very heavily against Prussia. They don't like Prussia anymore. And that's why Prussia has an incentive to invade Saxony. If I was playing with the Silesian, trying to make a Silesian campaign, the diplomacy table would have to change and be different. Now, it's quite possible to get France in as a Prussian ally instead of going for Hanover, or maybe an addition. Can't quite read that. So. Diplomacy takes place once. Yeah, we talked about that. Dice rolled for each country. Is it in the order? I think so. Yeah, in the order they appear. So Hanover rolls after France. All modifiers are cumulative if Austria, blah, blah, blah. If a power is neutral during the first grand strategy sequence, it's possible it'll be forced to construct diplomacy again in the course of the game. If Austria or Prussia invade a neutral country from 1757 onward, all other neutral countries immediately consult the diplomacy table with a die roll modifier of 2 against the invader. So you probably don't want to invade neutral countries. It doesn't really help you for the most part. The Saxony thing is a special case because, and I'm going to do it, but I'm not sure it's the best move. It might be better to say, screw it, Saxony will end up against me, but maybe I'll have France and Hanover as allies somehow. That's pretty unlikely, but it might be possible. The problem is the Austrians have more points than the Prussians do. So, okay. The counter is labeled, I'm not seeing the British special rule here. Britain gets to roll again at other times. The counters labeled Empire are used for the small German principalities. Now, Saxony uses these same counters, but I had to... I replaced the Empire counters with some counters from Empires in Arms, or I'm sorry, War and Peace, just because there's not enough counters to have both Saxony and the Empire in the game. You can mint new counters anyway, but this is what they suggest doing because they could actually end up on separate sides. If France or Hanover is belligerent at any time during the course of the campaign, both players may enter the German states without disturbing them. However, the victory point values of the fortresses within Germany only count if France or Hanover are on different sides during the campaign game. If they're on the same side, or one or both are neutral, then no victory points are awarded for the German states. But I'm looking for the British special rule. I don't know. Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg, and Poland can be entered by forces of other players without disturbing neutrality of any country. East Prussia is considered part of Prussia. The fortress of Königsberg is considered Prussian. I need to find the British rule now. I'm not finding it. This is really disturbing to me because I thought there were two things here. One is that Britain could enter the war late. And the other is that Russia could switch sides, as they do briefly in I don't remember the scenario. The other thing is imperial troops kind of show up in scenarios, and you probably wouldn't chance them showing up into the game. Okay, well, we'll keep looking. But I'm not seeing anything about Britain entering the game here. Yeah. And I didn't see anything about Russia. It might be hidden in the force increment rules, which would not be unreasonable, I guess. The Austrian player gets 30 resources. The Prussians get 22. And each of these is essentially a 10% increase. During force increment phase throughout the campaign, the Prussian and Austrian players add up their strength points that they currently possess on the map board. Then they secretly write down a percentage figure they wish to increment their current forces. Each RP is going to be 10% of their current strength point level. They reveal these, and they get that number of strength points. These are considered reinforcements available to play, but they're not yet deployed on the map. They'll occur in the redeployment phase. If you don't have any RPs currently available, you may not increase his forces. Now, I'm going to test the system here. I think one side is going to go and throw all their points in, and just like, I mean, why not? You're never going to get more. You're going to suffer losses, which means then both sides should do that, right? I mean, seriously, you can triple your force with the Prussians and quadruple it with the Austrians, and why wouldn't you do that? This is the problem with this system, and I wish there was a limit per turn. Maybe there is. Maybe we'll say you can't increase more than 50% ever, just to put a limitation on there. They're not deployed on the map. They'll happen in the upcoming redeployment. The British provide a subsidy. If you have Hanover on your side, you roll a die, and there's some modifiers to that die roll, and it'll give you additional resource points that you can just add to your total. Then other countries roll if they're not neutral to see what percentage they get. I'm going to look at this. Okay, Russia has an asterisk, which this is how Russia switches sides, is off of getting a low roll on there. And let's see, we have subtract 1 on the grand strategic immediately preceding. I'm trying to see if these numbers combine to anything. They don't look like they do. They look like they affect everyone. If Hanover is neutral, subtract 1 from all French. If France is neutral, subtract 1 from all Hanoverian rolls. Yeah, I'm not seeing a later British entry here. I saw the Russian thing, which made sense. This is what we're looking at here. At the beginning of the grand campaign phase, each player has a certain number of leaders on the map. The leaders should be separated by country put aside. Basically, on each grand strategic sequence, you roll on here, and you will get new leaders equal to the number here. But if you get an asterisk, you have to sack one of your leaders. And I believe that can be of your choice who you sack, which means you're not going to sack the historical people or kill off the historical people who actually did. And again, problems with the design. During redeployment, you're allowed to shift your forces. First, both the Prussians and Austrians is performed openly, but you can't expose. The Austrians do it first. You simply pick them up and shift them to any fortress occupied by at least one SP of the same nationality. Then you then you get to place the new leaders on the board. And you get your additional forces. And then you start a new turn. Normal prisoner of war rules are adhered to. On even number turns, nationality makes no difference. A country surrenders when all the fortresses that are under its control at the beginning of the campaign game are in enemy hands, except for Russia and the Empire, which can never surrender. Saxony, for example, will surrender immediately upon the fall of both Torgau and Dresden to an enemy power. If they surrender, all of its forces are immediately removed from the map board, and they may never return to play, and no further commitment die rolls are made. If France is allied with Austria, it would only surrender if Venlo, Rarmond, and Wessel fall to the enemy in addition to Metz and Strasbourg. There's two of them there. Wessel up here. If Hanover is allied with Prussia, it would only surrender if Minden and Munster fall in addition to Hanover and Stade. Okay. Winning the game. The Prussians can win. Well, the Prussians or Austrians can win. If either side surrenders, the other side wins. Otherwise, it's fortresses. You don't worry about strength points in this. Immediately upon the conclusion of 1757 campaign and every year thereafter, you count the total number of victory points possessed in fortress hexes by each side, and you compare the totals. If you have more than 200%, you might have won. Otherwise, it'll continue. Now, there's an exception, and it's poorly written here. We'll get to that in a moment. If the Prussian player has 90... If one side has more than 200% in victory points than the other, it wins if it currently possesses 4 of the following 5: Breslau, Prague, Vienna, Magdeburg, and Dresden. Now, 3 of those are in Austrian hands. No, Breslau is in Prussian hands. Okay. So 2 of them are in Austrian hands, Prague and Vienna. Magdeburg and Breslau are in Prussian hands, and Dresden is the even one, which is, again, a reason why you want to take Saxony, because the chance of Saxony joining the alliance is just so high. Now, here's the thing, though. If Saxony joins the alliance, why would you invade it? Well, because you can knock it out in that first turn before they have a chance of joining in, I guess is the thing. I'm going to play it with the historical. Otherwise, at the end of 1762, if there's still no victor in the combat, the war automatically ends, because it is the 7 Years' War. It can only go 7 years. And you can still count points and see who wins. based on victory points. As long as the Prussians, if the Prussians have more victory points, they have to have every fortress in Silesia. If the Austrians want to win a marginal victory, they have to have more victory points and 2 fortresses in Silesia. Otherwise, it's just a complete draw. And I am a little disturbed by not finding that rule for the British. I'm going to look again. I'm wondering if maybe I drew something out of reading the Silesian Wars thing about how the Brits were trying to stay out of it, out of the historical narrative, and just, you know, somehow baked that into here. I'm not sure. If we look at the 1757 scenario, Hanover's in the game to begin with. I think there are some ways of breaking this campaign, but I want to give it a try, and that's why I'm doing it. I've never been too thrilled with the game without a campaign, and my own attempts at trying to make one kind of didn't go very far. So let's send this up. We'll try it. I think I can break this campaign very easily, though. I may start making up rules to prevent it from breaking. For example, that it doesn't really make sense that you could like quadruple the size of your army. So it's a 7 years. There's 6 years in play. If you were only able to add 5 points for each of those 6 years, that would be 30 points. That's what the Austrians actually have. So, I mean, maybe I'll make it 10 points or whatever. But I get the feeling you want to dump the most points you can early, because you might be able to overwhelm your opponent that way. Numbers are what tell in this system. All right, let's send it up and see what happens.